Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. After several decades of building its nuclear potential, which threatens the entire Middle East, but most especially Israel, Iran is now in a unique position. It is at the same time most dangerous and weakest. The highly enriched fissile material it has accumulated is enough for several military devices in a short time span, which makes Iran a legitimate target, and the destruction of its air and missile defense units makes it vulnerable. If that is the case, what is the net result of Israel's cost-benefit calculations? Should it strike now and get rid of its most ominous problem, at least for the immediate future, or is it better for it to keep it powder dry and let President Donald Trump try diplomacy first? To help us dissect these matters are with me here in the studio Dr. Uzi Arad, who formerly served as Israel's National Security Advisor, the Director of the National Security Council, and a division chief at Mossad. It's good to see you.
Good to be here.
Always a pleasure indeed. Also with us here in the studio is Brigadier General in Reserve, Dr. Amnon Sofrin, formerly the Chief of the Intelligence Division at Mossad, as well as a Senior IDF Intelligence Directorate Officer. It's also a pleasure to have you with us here.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, many question marks with regard to this topic that we've covered extensively for a very long time now. What should we focus on in today's discussion?
So Iran is obviously Israel's biggest and perhaps existential threat, and opportunity beckons because of the two dimensions which you mentioned in your introduction. First, the danger is perhaps at the highest level ever. Iran is a threshold state. It is very close to being able to weaponize the fissile material and perhaps equip itself with half a dozen or so warheads. But at the same time, because last October, the Israeli Air Force managed to peel off most of its air and missile defense, it is also vulnerable. So it is a target of opportunity now. And the question is, in the longer run, because presumably whatever Israel destroys, they may try to rebuild, whether it is worth the effort. And that goes back to what you mentioned, the US position. If there is a green or even an amber light from Washington, one can see the Israeli government okaying a strike.
Very interesting indeed. Well, Dr. Araz, I'd like to ask you particularly, since on the one hand, as Mr. Oren mentioned, the October 26th strike on Iranian infrastructure, military infrastructure to be particular, but there was also a report about a specific strike in Pelchin, which used to be an active nuclear site for testing, and after Israel's strike there were reports circulating about the potential that it was once again active, but of course in a classified setting under the current regime in Tehran. And on the other end, we have the Ayatollah regime openly stating that they're not going to negotiate with the United States, not at least under the maximum pressure campaign, but nonetheless, diplomacy is off the table. And this past weekend, we heard Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian coming out and saying that even though he wanted to negotiate with the Americans, the Supreme Leader established a decree, and by doing so, he is now bound by those decisions. So where is Israel in this context, and to what degree are the Americans and Israelis closely aligned on the necessity to establish some type of carrot and stick?
Well, this is a very dangerous point in affairs in the Middle East, because if you allow things to proceed by their own logic, we may end up with either a preventive Israeli strike using this moment of opportunity in order to deflect Iran from pursuing the nuclear option operationally. That strike could take the form of hitting on valuable targets in Iran, which would include the nuclear sites, but that is not the only target, but there would be certainly regime targets, military targets. It would be a costly attack, which would give the Iranians reason to pause. Primarily, also remember the singular vulnerability that Iran has in terms of its oil and gas industry. One can incapacitate the economy by acting against those targets, and they are very, very much exposed. So the possibility of a preventive Israeli action is very much on the agenda. It is there for other reasons as well. Recently, under the impression of the war in Gaza and elsewhere, you have seen Israeli reassessments of their own strategy more in direction of prevention and possible preemption rather than passive defense or awaiting being targeted first. So this change of direction into the domain leads you into the conclusion that maybe it is considering seriously practicing this policy on this target. Finally, it is Iran itself which is begging for this in essence, as long as it declares its policy to bring about Israel destruction. It is very, very unusual when a nation declares the elimination of another nation as its objective. And as long as you have that being the declared objective as well as the practical objective, practice perhaps through the proxies. It need not be a nuclear attack on Israel, which Iran has been imagining. It has been the kind of war of attrition affected by this multi-front attack through the proxies. So those being the serious manifestations of the Iranian strategy to bring about Israel's demise, as indeed we've seen some of the Hamas operatives thinking that maybe the moment has arrived in which Israel could succumb to this kind of indirect Iranian pressure on it. All these add up to the need for an Israeli preventive action no matter what. But the Iranians themselves should, and I suppose, would have to balance that against the fact that they may, in essence, bring on their own demise by pursuing this line of action. They have an interest in preventing this escalation, because if it will escalate into Iran becoming an operationally nuclear state, the inevitable conclusion is that others in the region would pursue, possibly Israel, because it said it would never be the second or the first, but certainly it could become the second. So it would be a multi-nuclear Middle East. And in that context, that suddenly Iran becomes exposed to military or to nuclear capacities that could be directed at it. So as a certain Israeli commented informally to an Iranian national, saying, "You will live to regret the day that you moved from the safety and security of your condition before you became nuclear into the highly dangerous condition that you may reach if and when you do become nuclear." So if only for this consideration, plus the fact that Israel will do all it needs to prevent a threat to its existence, that Iran would stand to benefit from stalling and suggesting a pause rather than seeking to advance further.
Interesting indeed. Well, General Sofrin, a couple of observations, and I'd like to hear your take on that. The first one is the fact that we haven't heard in the last several weeks public statements from either Israel or the United States regarding Iran's nuclear program, except for responses to concrete questions, which raises, of course, questions on the known statement of when diplomacy fails, guns start blazing, or in that context. But nonetheless, the second observation is Iran is naturally looking at two specific scenarios. One in which Israel is allegedly a nuclear power, and yet it's embroiled in a multi-front conventional war. And Russia is also a superpower when we're talking about the nuclear capacity in its storages, and yet it's still embroiled in a conventional war that has slowly encroached on various red lines, and yet we don't see the translation into the nuclear dimension. Within that context, there is the escalation dominance angle, where you have, of course, various steps before reaching the utilization, of course, or deployment of such a payload. But nonetheless, the Iranians are in a position where the number one priority is the preservation of the regime. So long they don't have nuclear weapons, is that regime preservation under threat? And if so, is this their sole purpose of pursuing a nuclear weapon?
I think that when you look at the interests of the Iranian regime, it has several dimensions. The first one is to be the dominant Muslim country in the Middle East and in the whole world. And that means that if you want to be the most dominant one, then you have to have something that nobody has. And that's nuclear weapon system. That's it. Second, ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, they're under the impression that the West is trying to tear down this regime and to exchange it, and they need some what we call insurance card. And in their own point of view, the insurance card is to have nuclear weapon systems that will assist them in demonstrating power and projecting power, and to say, don't mess with us because we can go crazy. Okay? Now, aside from that, if you look at the technical side, we are all speaking like as if tomorrow morning they will have a nuclear device. It is a long process. It will take at least a year and a half, if not more than that. And this is the minimum. That means that the fact that you have what we call enriched material doesn't really mean that tomorrow morning you have a device. You have to take a long time, and to adjust it into a warhead, often what we call ballistic missile, it will take longer. That means that it's not something that will be available tomorrow morning. We still have leverage and we still have time to move on and to try to block it in other means. Now, the Americans are trying to go by applying pressure on Iran to force them to go to a negotiation table and to begin dealing with another deal that in the end will put end to their efforts, or at least postpone it. The fact that what was signed on 2015 was delayed their advance until about 2 years ago. That's a lot of time. And time is money in this case. That means that in this time you have time to prepare yourself, you have time to plan, you have time to build your capacity and to make sure that if and when you decide to do something, you will have the ability to do that. Okay? Now, regarding that, if the Americans will broker a deal with the Iranians that will postpone the ability to build up a nuclear device until 10, 15 years ahead, for Israel, I think it's good enough for the time being, okay? Because, it is an ongoing process. You delay it and you delay it and you push it ahead and you push it ahead and so on. I don't see any scenario right now is that Israel is going to attack directly Iran without coordinating with the Americans, without American support, and without American assistance. Direct assistance and not indirect one. Now, ever since Mr. Trump says that he wants to go to a diplomatic solution, we're not able right now to launch any attack on our own initiative without consulting the Americans, or at least coordinating with them. So I think that this is quite complicated. We can declare many things, and to please be careful, because we're going to get very angry and we're going to do something that you are going to regret. But it's not that so, not to that extent.
Is there a scenario in which the Americans are not a party to such a confrontation, considering the fact that, let's say, hypothetically, Israel launching an attack on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. It further degrades also the ballistic missile arsenals and various key components in Iran's long list of targets. And the expected Iranian response will be to target the Gulf Arab countries, namely Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, potentially even Bahrain, and also, last but not least, Qatar, despite having a unique relationship between Doha and Tehran. In such an event, the United States has guaranteed to those countries, last stated also by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, during the meeting with his Saudi counterpart at the Pentagon, that that the United States is committed to the security of Saudi Arabia, and it would respond to any conflagration from either Iran or its proxies, which is, of course, the extension to the previous administration. Does this mean that the United States would be drawn in regardless of the initial equation?
We have seen last year, by reading the leaked documents, Pentagon documents, but leaked by a CIA analyst, probably of Arab extraction or Muslim extraction, that the US, even though it's Israel's bosom buddy, best partner, nevertheless keeps surveillance over Israel. The documents portrayed what happened at the Israeli Air Force bases, presumably designated as going against the Iranians, but also one must assume that the Americans are also looking at the Israeli decision-making process to see whether the Israeli...
To avoid any surprises, basically.
But once they suspect that there is a surprise, they will intervene and tell the Israeli government in no uncertain terms what the policy is. Now, there is this old debate, should we tell them and thereby make them complicit, or should we do it and then they can apologize to their Arab clients and say, we didn't know? We are beyond that. Now, let me surprise you. The Iranians once had a legitimate case for going nuclear. This was during the Cold War, when they feared a Soviet invasion, and the Shah started developing his nuclear program. Later, when Iraq had its nuclear program, the Iranians feared an Iraqi dominance of the Persian Gulf area, and they wanted to have something much like India and Pakistan. Now we are beyond that. Now the only target is Israel, and therefore there is a legitimate Israeli concern. The upshot is, if you are going to take on the lion, you must kill him, not wound him. And the way to kill the lion, as was mentioned earlier, is hitting the regime too. Because as long as they have the intention, in addition to the capability, they will rebuild it. So you must make sure, alongside the kinetic strike at your nuclear targets, that there is another regime which is not hostile towards Israel.
Indeed. Well, let's bring the Europeans into this equation, Dr. Arad. When we're looking at the leverage the Europeans currently have, particularly the E3, namely France, Britain, and Germany, in October 18th, we are expected to have the final right before the expiration of the so-called snapback mechanism under UN Security Council Resolution 2231, during the course of which they are in a very problematic scenario, since if the Iranians do break out now into nuclear weapon capabilities, Germany has already discussed potentially breaking out nuclear. We're seeing additional European countries discussing these matters, including Poland, which has already committed that if Germany turns nuclear, so will they. And not only there, let's go to the Pacific, where we're seeing, of course, the South Koreans and the Japanese even, who are, of course, in a different category altogether because of the sensitivities of this issue. But taking all that into account, if the Iranians break out, is this the end of the NPT?
Well, if they break out, we used to say that we would see the expansion of proliferation primarily in the Middle East. And in our kind of canonical scenario, we said, if Iran breaks out, then we would, soon after that, would have a multipolar Middle East in which countries with necessary aspirations and also defense, such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, will follow. You have already Pakistan. And that is dangerous enough, and that would also affect and suggest that indeed the NPT regime has not been able to hold, the number of countries contained. But now the pressure for proliferation is not only because of events in the Middle East. They look into, you see Japan looking into its options in the face of Chinese expansion and aggression. You see in Europe, if America does not provide, say, further defense, a country like Germany will not be beyond thinking its own options, being right to the front. So you'd have for other regional parties about South Korea, all those countries that depended on American defense agreements now may have less to rely on and would face. So we may see further erosion of the NPT in other directions. So it could be the unraveling, in a sense, of the NPT. By the way, North Korea was the first to do it, to get out and then become on the open, and then starting its own policy in which it traded its condition for money. It made that into a lever for money purposes. So that could be the situation. But at the same time, you may have now considerations which are, trying to slow down the process for fear that indeed the NPT agreement would be unraveled. And that is that it would render the options of first strike present all over. Countries we may all move into the preemptive option, and that is a high-risk thing. When everybody is nuclear, then you cannot assume necessarily a balanced condition of deterrence. You may fear a technological drive to become first or to acquire first-right capability, benefiting from some breakthrough in technology, which today is a very dynamic, and that by itself is highly destabilizing. So that is a further complication which would go beyond the very unraveling of the NPT. On top of that, you add the fact that in the Ukraine, we've seen games by the Russians to depart from the policy of using nuclear options against non-nuclear states. The Chernobyl threats, the threats of using weapons if attacked inside against the Ukraine. This is a more aggressive posture that we've seen ever before. So for all those reasons, we've seen a different dynamic altogether. But I would argue that in this case, maybe the NPT by itself is not a sufficient barrier, but we would see other type of international cooperative efforts to restrain the race for self-interest, because on the whole, all countries concerned want to benefit and improve their security condition, but in fact they are helping run the world into a much more dangerous for everybody.
General Sophie, snapback, is that viable for the Europeans? And what Dr. Ara just mentioned, will that be one of the triggers for the European calculus?
I think that the Europeans have actually two considerations. The first one is to block Iran from getting to a nuclear device. And the second one is what they call economical considerations. They want to go on and trade with Iran to get a lot of money because Iran is a great investment. They did it before, they're going to do it next. but dependent on what we call on the stand of the United States.
Of course, it's a great investment, not under the current regime. So there is that aspect. But if I may very briefly, does the United States particularly, alongside its European partners, Israel potentially, and others in the region, should all those nations together start planning for the day after the Ayatollah regime in the event that this turns into a significant conflagration that the regime itself won't withstand?
I think this is what we call positive thinking.
Positive thinking.
I don't see it happening tomorrow morning and not in the coming years.
In one word, cyber, which we didn't mention, this is going to be the big test of cyber, whether without a kinetic strike, this could bring about the end of the nuclear project of Iran.
Very interesting indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Uzi Arad, Brigadier General in Reserve, Dr. Amnon Sofrin, and Mr. Amir Oren for all of your insights. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.
The Middle East, home to the cradle of civilization, retains a reputation from time immemorial as one of the most complex, conflict-ridden regions of the world. A cluster of nations, religions, powers, and influences, Mideast intricacies pose conundrums to even the most astute individuals. Bombarded daily, indeed every minute, by a barrage of information, some accurate, yet most of it less so, TV7 Israel invites you to watch and hear some of the most knowledgeable experts, most of whom partook in creating policies shaping this region today. Join us for Jerusalem Studio every Tuesdays and Fridays for content that truly matters.
Jerusalem Studio, now available on Spotify.